to the overview of the book of Titus. Titus is a really remarkable book that lays out, in a lot of ways, what we could say is a blueprint for how the church is to function. And so if you have questions about what your role is in God's church, this book is for you. You won't be able to read through the book of Titus without hearing God's instructions for your role in his church. And so I love the book of Titus. It's really practical and has application not only for church leaders, but for every member of God's church in relation to their family, their church community, and even into the broader community and workplace. The big idea of this book is that truth or sound doctrine will lead to godliness in the life of a Christian. So true teaching will result in godly living. All of this stems from the gospel truth of God's saving grace through the work of Jesus Christ in his death, and the Spirit's application of that work in regeneration and sanctification in the life of every member of God's church. To give you a quick framework for this book, let's look at the setting and the context. Titus is written by the Apostle Paul. Paul identifies himself in verse 1. And you might remember Paul is a missionary church planter and apostle of Jesus Christ. He was saved during a really dramatic experience while on his way to persecute the church. His missionary travels are recorded in the book of Acts, and he's the author of really a majority of the New Testament. Paul identifies himself in verse 1, and he describes himself as a servant of God for the sake of his church. Well, verse 4 of chapter 1 tells us who the book is written to. He says this book is written to Titus. And Titus is a co-worker of Paul's. You can find Titus mentioned in the book of Acts, in 2 Corinthians, in Galatians, as well as in 1 and 2 Timothy. And Titus has traveled with Paul during portions of his missionary journeys. Paul is really clear to describe why he's writing this book in verse 5. Let me read that to you. Titus 1:5, he says, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order, and appoint elders in every town, as I directed you." And so what's happened is Paul has planted several churches on a small island called Crete. And now he's left Titus behind to finish the work that he started. And so this is what he means by putting what remained into order. He's left him there to appoint elders in every town, in each church community that's left in each town. And so this really affirms the pattern of what we find in the book of Acts, where Paul goes and plants churches. He stays there for a time, raising up leaders to leave behind to continue the work. So you see that with Timothy in the city of Ephesus, and we find that here on the island of Crete with Titus. Paul has left Titus in Crete to finish the work of developing, teaching, training elders to lead in each church and in every town across this island. Now we need to talk about Crete for a little bit because it's going to help set the framework for the things that Paul says in this book. Crete is a small island off the coast of Greece in the Mediterranean Sea. The island is known in Paul's day as Party Island. And so you might think of places in our culture like the city of Las Vegas. Places where you say what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. This was the idea of Crete. It was a place known for a place to go partake in sin and debauchery. And we see that especially as Paul describes Cretans. Paul calls them out in this way. When he quotes, this is how the Cretans define themselves. In Titus 1 verse 12, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." And so it's this context that Titus finds himself, and this is where Paul has gone, and now Titus is is there to present God as the answer to these people's sin. What the people believe to be true about God will directly correlate to how they live their lives in godliness. And so it's important that Paul, from the beginning, presents God not as a liar who partakes in sin, which is the gods of the Cretans, but rather as the faithful God of truth. And this is what's going to set the tone for how God's people are to live. And so from there, and that's really the first 4 or 5 verses you find Paul communicating, this is the faithful God, this is the true God. Paul lays out the blueprint for discipleship, and it's clear throughout the book. Paul expects Titus to raise up men who will pour into younger men. Older women are to be trained to pour into younger women and to instruct them in godly living. And so that's really the framework for the book. Let's work our way really briefly through each chapter. It's just 3 chapters long, but each chapter is packed full of gospel truth for us that will equip God's people to live correctly. Chapter 1, we see God as the true God. We see Titus' ministry described, as well as a list of qualifications for godly elders and for who the church should look for to be an elder, to be a pastor in the body. Chapter 2 gives us instructions for how Titus is to teach for true doctrine and the importance of the grace of God. And so we see each stage of life listed out here. And so there's older men, older women, younger men, slaves. Every stage of life is to reflect God's grace through good works or godly living. And so the importance of how each person lives their lives is described in chapter 2, verse 10, as adorning the doctrine of God, our Savior. And so as God's people live according to the truth in godliness, they're going to reflect and add beauty to the gospel. This will make Jesus more beautiful and attractive to the world in which they live. And the basis for all of what Titus teaches is found in the gospel. It's rooted in the gospel. So you get to the end of chapter 2 and you find that the grace of God is what makes all of this possible. It's the grace of God that saves and transforms and sets the people of God apart from the world in hope and in good works. All of this comes as a free gift of grace through Jesus Christ. This is the bedrock for the sound teaching that Titus is to teach. Well, then chapter 3 instructs God's people in relation to the world around them. So chapter 2 kind of focuses in to how they relate to each other, how they relate to God. Chapter 3 describes how they relate to the world around them in the public square. And it's a lot of the same thing. So God's people are to be marked by their good works, by their love and kindness, not in the fighting and quarreling that characterizes the people of Crete. And so chapter 3, we see Titus called to remind them of the truth. Remind the Christians on the island of Crete to be careful to devote themselves to good works. That's 3 verse 8. This again will contrast the way the culture lives, where they find themselves. Well, this book concludes with personal instructions from Paul and one final call to learn to be devoted to good works, be generous, and bear good fruits. So this short book continually reminds Titus, the young pastor of the Church of Crete, of the importance of sound teaching or correct doctrine that will result in godly living in the home, in the church, and in the public square. And that's the book of Titus.